Hi, my name is Maggie Palmer, and this video is just to describe in a bit more detail one of the healing methods that I work with, which is the trauma clearing method. I started working with energy healing 25 plus years ago. I lost my father at the age of 18, and this naturally created grief-related depression and other mental and emotional health issues, which my doctor at the time wasn't able to help with, and there was no real interest in helping me find a non-medical fix for what I was experiencing, and 2 prescriptions for antidepressants were written out for me, which I promptly tore up because I knew that wasn't the right way for me. And this started a journey around age 18, 19 of me really looking deeply into alternative healing practices to see if there was some way that I could alleviate the pain that I was going through natural means. So I began to learn hands-on energy healing, and in my 20s that went on to taking it to the study of Reiki, which I then went on to teach and have been practicing and teaching in my own way for over 15 years now. To cut a very long story short, my mother then passed away in my 30s, which led me to deepen my study of energy healing, and I then took a 2-year immersive shamanic healing course with some wonderful teachers in Glastonbury, where I learned core cutting, soul retrieval, regression, genetic regression, sound healing, and went on to practice all of these techniques with other people, as well as use all of these to great effect to help me deal with and address personal issues that needed dealing with, and to heal from some of the pain and the trauma that I'd experienced up until that point. And these were, again, very effective for me, and they did get me a certain way towards healing the burden of emotional and non-physical pain in my life, as well as help me treat the physical pain that I was experiencing as well. That's another story. I've also had a very long physical healing path with autoimmune issues, which are now finally resolving because I've started to find the real answer. But on the non-physical, all of these shamanic and energy healing techniques were incredibly helpful in addressing depression, anxiety, certain addictive tendencies that I had. I even used core cutting to help me heal from a lifelong addiction to sugar, which was crippling me and affecting me in a very direct physical way. But it was in February 2021 that I had some memories of childhood trauma that had been deeply buried surface for me. And thankfully, even though we were in a pandemic and a lockdown, my husband had studied the shamanic course with me, and he knew how to facilitate some of those techniques to help me in the immediate crisis of remembering these events to stabilize. But I knew that I needed more help, and that started the process of me trying to find somebody who could help me shift what was remaining of that trauma burden. And I believe I was led to the work of David Ian Rogers, who is a wonderful shamanic practitioner who I saw being interviewed on a YouTube channel that I followed at the time. I watched him work his method with an audience member, and I found it a bit discombobulating at first because it required him to make a series of strange noises and faces, and it seemed incredibly simple and quick as a process. But I watched the woman who had volunteered to work this process on the show live undergo an obvious energetic shift and transformation in front of my eyes, and I knew at that point that I needed to reach out to David and find out a bit more about how he worked and see if it was right for me. So I reached out to him, and he, finding out that I was a practitioner of healing as well, fast-tracked me. He has a 3-month wait list usually. And I had 2 sessions with him, one in August of 2021 and the second one, a much shorter one, 2 months afterwards. And although all of the healing processes I've worked with and gone on to then learn and facilitate for other people have been profoundly helpful for me in my life. If I had to pinpoint one healing experience that had been the biggest catalyst for the deepest healing in my life and the most profound shift, it would be the work I did with David. So David, during the process of working together, identified that he felt that I would be a suitable fit to learn his technique. So he taught his technique to me, and I've since been working this for the last 2 years with other people, and to what I feel is equally good effect. Before I talk about the process and how it worked for me, just to mention a bit about David's story. I won't tell his whole story. I would heartily recommend anybody watching this who's interested to go and find his website and to look up his book, because it's a fascinating story, and he'll definitely be able to tell it better than I can. But David underwent a very traumatic experience, which prompted him to then look into the whole world of spiritual energetic healing in a way that he'd never considered before. He'd had no interest whatsoever. But the trauma he experienced had created patterns in him that were destroying his life, including a severe gambling addiction. And his desire to work out how he could fix that in himself took him to Tibet to work with monks in Tibet, and then to the Andean mountains to work with Andean shamans. And he was able to piece together what he describes as a mind puzzle, uncovering ancient healing techniques and creating a system, or resurrecting a system, to help interrupt the seemingly endless looping effects of trauma. And what he learned was that when we experience trauma, it's stored in 3 places in our being. So we have our subconscious mind, which is where the memory is stored, conscious mind, which is where any self-limiting beliefs generated by the trauma, such as I'm not good enough, I'm not worthy, I'm not lovable, those self-limiting beliefs and patterns would then be stored in the conscious mind. And then you have a large hip flexor muscle, the psoas muscle that sits between your hips, which is where David learned is where the emotional and energetic charge from the trauma gets stored. So you have a 3-point loop between these 3 areas of the being where emotions, memories, thoughts keep cycling around again and again and again every time the trauma memory gets triggered. And what David discovered was that as a practitioner, if you invite the person who's on the receiving end just to allow a trauma memory to surface enough, not to re-traumatize, but just enough for them to access the feelings that come with that and some of those self-limiting beliefs, that you can take an action to gently shock the person out of that low frequency state very quickly into a different frequency. Doing something daft in his case, which I've now had to learn to do, sometimes that can then make the person laugh, which is an added bonus because laughter is the best medicine and it's a very high frequency emotion. But even just momentarily shocking somebody out of thinking or feeling something very low related to a trauma can be enough to snap through that 3-point loop temporarily. And then the second part of the process is working with the deep belly breathing technique, which is a closed circuit form of breathing, which takes you deep into the belly to access the energetic charge stuck in that psoas muscle and help to release it through the breath. And all the shamanic work I've ever learned has been effective primarily because of breath work. Breath work is the vehicle to get into the body and to access trapped emotion or energy that's stored in the body, in the cells, and the vehicle to get it out of the body and out of the being. This process is no different. So as a practitioner, you guide the person on the receiving end to do a series of these closed circuit deep belly breath techniques, and you're watching. This is all done via video link. It's much easier that way. But you're watching the person on the receiving end to see when they reach that point where they've done enough of this breath work to have shifted permanently. And then you invite the person on the receiving end to go back to the memory that they had been holding and looking to clear only a moment before. And if this method has worked for them, it should be for them like it was for me, where you feel like you're groping around in your mind trying to remember something that you've forgotten, like when you're trying to remember the details of a dream and it just starts to disappear, or if you're trying to remember a story that someone had told you 20 years ago and you couldn't quite remember the details and there's no emotional attachment to the story. It's very like that. And it feels miraculous and it feels too good to be true. And because it's quick, the process works in a few minutes. It's possible in the session to, and I work the same way that David does because he's taught me his technique. I do it I set up a session the same way that he does, but you set up an initial 3-hour session. For some people, that tends to be enough. In that 3-hour session, you invite that the person on the receiving end of the healing to remember as much as they can of the trauma memories of their life and to clear as many of those as you're able to in that 3-hour session. And if a follow-up session is required, then that's included in the cost of what you pay for that primary session. So for me, I had the most incredible experience where on 2 occasions, as I was going through my own list of trauma memories I wanted to clear, one of them I was trembling all over, physically trembling all over at the memory of what I was looking to clear. And moments later, once the process had been complete, I was invited to go back and retrieve that memory again. Not only do I struggle to retrieve the memory and even remember what it was we were trying to clear, but the physical trembling had stopped completely, and I've not experienced that since, and that's 2 years ago now. It's over 2 years ago now. Also on one occasion, this was dealing with the loss of my parents, which was still very painful for me, even though I'd done a great deal of work on that. Invited to remember that. My eyes were full of tears, physical pain in my chest, and very heavily burdened by the feeling of grief. And only a few minutes later, I couldn't access anything like the same level of pain. Obviously, that doesn't mean that I don't still miss my parents terribly and that I don't experience moments of grief. Of course I do, but it's no longer what I would describe as a crippling burden that's holding me back from moving forward in my life. And so at this point, I want to make the point that this process isn't a miracle cure, and it's not a click your fingers, wave a magic wand, one session, and all of your trauma is cleared, and you never have to experience any pain or anxiety or upset ever again in your life. I mean, if there is a method that works like that, I'd love to know about it. It's, for me, what it was a catalyst to shift, if I had to put a figure on it, 70% of the burden energetically and emotionally of trauma that I was carrying up until that point. The other 30-odd%, I now realize 2 years later, my body held on to just a bit more because I wasn't yet eating the right foods and living in the right way to support myself, for my body to feel safe enough and supported enough to release that last bit of pain it was still carrying. 2 years later, thanks to doing this trauma clearing process, and I really do attribute so much of the change in my life to that initial session, I've been able to identify all of the patterns of behavior, patterns of thinking, ways of being, personality traits that I had structured as a result of trauma. Once the emotional burden of the trauma had been shifted, or the greatest extent of it had been shifted in that first session, it became so clear to me how so many of the things that I thought were habitually just me and my ways of doing things were trauma-based and could then be dismantled, taken apart, unpicked, released, and replaced with healthy and honouring behaviours and ways of thinking and ways of being that would support me instead. To give just a couple of examples, and there are many, I've always had a terrible junk food diet where I was self-medicating with food, as mentioned, with sugar. I didn't mention it earlier, I had to use cord cutting to help me eliminate a lifelong addiction to sugar. So I had been self-medicating with food all of my life, and I'd always known it wasn't right, and I'd found a number of ways to help me mitigate it, but never fully heal it. After the trauma clearing session, I was able to really clearly see that it was trauma that had informed all those choices. And because I didn't feel the pain any longer, I wasn't carrying that in my being anymore, I was no longer compelled to eat the kinds of things that I would have eaten to self-medicate and to make myself feel better and to get the dopamine hit that you get from sugar and carbs and the rubbish processed foods that I used to live on. Fast forward 2 years and I'm on pretty much a carb-free diet, and the autoimmune issues that I may have touched on earlier are all now healing. So that's just one thing, but there were so many other patterns. I was overextending myself. I was people pleasing. I was staying up until 3 o'clock in the morning, like clockwork every night, unable to get to bed or get to sleep any sooner than that. I now go to bed at 9:30 every night. Still a shock to me after 30 years of as soon as I was able to staying up until a stupid time in the morning, making myself sick. That's the way that I breathe. I was holding my breath. I had really unhealthy patterns of breathing that were related to trauma and being in a permanent state of fight or flight. I still occasionally have to correct myself, but I'm so much better with that now. I realised after the trauma clearing that I'd spent most of my life trying to escape being in my body. And now every day I do a full body stretch routine and I go to the gym 3 times a week, which is something you would never have caught me doing 2 years ago. Developing little muscles now, weight training. I use my rebounder, I go for walks every day, and I actually enjoy feeling in my physical body now, whereas I used to do anything I could to escape from that for most of my life. So that's just to mention a few massive shifts that have taken place for me, and just to illustrate that although the initial session is a really powerful shift in itself, the ongoing shifts that happen afterwards are possible because of that initial shift. And although in essence I'm still the same person I was before I had the trauma clearing session, all of my habits and my routines and patterns have completely changed, and they're now self-honoring and self-supporting instead of self-sabotaging. And for me, that's massive. And I'm also getting to see that with some of the other people that I'm working this process with, which is just wonderful to see. Not only is it a lovely process to work in the moment because it is funny and it's fun and daft. I have to get over myself. I have to make a bit of a clown of myself in order for this to work. But once I'm in the moment, I actually thoroughly enjoy it. But watching and listening to how this then unfolds in the lives of the people that I've worked it with is just as satisfying as working the process itself. And what I found working with this process recently is that I've had 2 clients who had very vivid past life memories that were traumatic for them, and that we were able to use this technique to clear the past life memories as well as memories from the present life. So whatever your opinions or beliefs are about past lives and what they are and what our memories of them are, they certainly can be traumatic, they certainly can be a burden, and this process does work to clear those burdens and feelings in the same way that it does events of this lifetime. So that's all been wonderful to see as well. It isn't just the session itself, but there is a commitment that follows. Actually, we, as practitioners, we have to advise that if you decide to book this as a session, that you try to book it where you know that you have 2 weeks afterwards, where you're not heavily committed. Doesn't mean it has to be a 2-week holiday, but try not to have this session when you know that you've got heavy work commitments over the next 2 weeks afterwards, because you can feel very sleepy and drowsy as your physical body catches up with the great energetic shifts that you've undergone, releasing the traumas of a lifetime or more in some cases. And what was really, really helpful for me was being able to sit and do mindful activities like sketching with colour pencils in my garden, and just spending time on my own, grounding and deep belly breathing, working with deep stretch techniques into my hips and working with the breath. And activities that got me into the body and out of my mind were really, really helpful for the few weeks and months that followed. And during those processes and those moments, that was when those insights would come to me about patterns and behaviors and routines that could be changed. Now that I'd released the burden that had created those in the first place. So it's not just the session itself, there is ongoing work to do, but that's the case with any kind of shamanic healing or energetic healing work I've ever done. There's always homework, but if you're committed to healing, you will willingly do that and actually find it a joyous process to watch your transformation in real time and to feel yourself shifting and liberating out of self-sabotaging and limiting patterns and ways of thinking. Beautiful thing. I certainly wouldn't have it any other way. So because I'm relatively new to this process, I don't charge what David would charge. My charge is £180 for that initial 3-hour session. That also includes any mop-up or follow-up sessions that are required, as many as are required. On average, most people seem to need only 1 or 2, but I have had a couple of clients who've needed to revisit and go back for a couple more, and that's absolutely fine. Again, that's all included in the initial charge. And sometimes, on a couple of occasions, I've identified that a client could benefit from not just more of this particular method, but maybe one of the other methods that I work with as well. So sometimes a cord cutting has been helpful if there's been a particular relationship that's needed a little bit of an extra shift. And more specifically, soul retrieval or power retrieval work can be really helpful in terms of, so the cord cutting technique and this trauma clearing technique I see as a kind of a clean-up operation to remove burdens, energy, pain, trauma, connections that are keeping you stuck or limited. Once everything has been cleared out, there can be a case, in some cases, for retrieving lost power, lost energy, and lost soul parts that are still creating a feeling of something being missing. So soul retrieval and power retrieval techniques work really well for that, and I have worked those with a couple of clients after this process as a kind of follow-up, which has helped to complete the healing. So yeah, I mean, there's plenty more that I could probably say about this beautiful process. But I think that's enough. And if the sound of this is something that you would like to give a try, then please do reach out. I would love to see if I can work with you and help you to achieve the similar sort of shift and liberation that I've experienced myself. And thank you for your time. Take care.